okay, yeah, maybe I'll lose my temper sometimes. Not quite like that, you know. And so it told me this.
Right.
You know, you didn't like the first one? I said, no, I just didn't know what to make of it. Oh, okay. Looked at me strangely. And Justin sort of looked the other way.
Barry Gibb swore he'd never do it. But 10 months after Maurice died, he walked into a studio and brought his brother back to life. Not metaphorically, literally. He made a song for Cliff Richard, with the keyboard recorded by his dead brother years earlier. And after that, what Barry revealed about Cliff, about a debt from a basement in Manchester 46 years ago, rewrites everything we thought we knew about the Bee Gees. Barry's 79 now, and in interviews, rare footage, and a 2022 documentary, almost nobody saw. Barry finally tells the truth about the man who changed his life before the Bee Gees were even a thing. This isn't the story you think it is. December 28, 1957, the day that changed everything. Here's what you don't know. On December 28, 1957, 67 years ago, an 11-year-old Barry Gibb was climbing the steps of the Gaumont Cinema in Manchester when he dropped a record. It shattered on the concrete. The record was Wake Up Little Susie by the Everly Brothers, and Barry's band, the Rattlesnakes, was supposed to mime to it on stage during the Saturday morning cinema intermission. The performance seemed ruined, but here's the part nobody talks about. Before Barry dropped that record, before the Rattlesnakes performed their first real gig, there was another kid performing that morning. His name was Brian Lewis, and according to Kenny Horrocks, the Rattlesnakes' T-chest bass player, Lewis regularly had the first 10-minute spot and sang Cliff Richard songs. Cliff Richard had just released Move It 4 months earlier in August 1957. It was Britain's first authentic rock and roll record, not some watered-down American import, but a real British kid playing real rock and roll. And every 11-year-old in Manchester wanted to be Cliff Richard, including Barry Gibb. This is documented in multiple sources. Barry himself stated that the Rattlesnakes played songs by Cliff Richard, Paul Anka, Buddy Holly, and the Everly Brothers by 1957. Also, a little search on Wikipedia will show you that Gibb's influences when he was in the Rattlesnakes were Tommy Steele, the Mills Brothers, the Everly Brothers, Paul Anka, and Cliff Richard. But why does that matter? Because for 46 years, from 1957 to 2003, Barry Gibb carried that influence with him. He never talked about it publicly. He credited the Everly Brothers, Roy Orbison, the Beatles. But Cliff Richard? That name rarely came up. And when Maurice died suddenly at age 53, Barry did something extraordinary to honor both Maurice and the man who'd inspired him to pick up a guitar in the first place. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, you need to understand what happened in that cinema basement. Because without that basement, there are no Bee Gees, no Stayin' Alive, no Saturday Night Fever, no 220 million records sold worldwide. The basement where the Bee Gees were born. Based on interviews with Paul Frost and Kenny Horrocks, the two childhood friends who played with the Rattlesnakes, we know exactly how Barry Gibb's obsession with Cliff Richard began. In 1955, when Barry was just 9 years old, his family had just moved back to Manchester from the Isle of Man, where they'd been living because his father Hugh couldn't find steady work. Barry's older sister Leslie had rock and roll records, Elvis, Buddy Holly, and yes, Cliff Richard. But Cliff was different. Elvis was American, untouchable, from another world. Cliff Richard was from Hertfordshire. He was British. He was proof that a working-class British kid with nothing could become a rock and roll star. In 1955, Barry formed the Rattlesnakes in the basement of Paul Frost's mother's house. Sarah Salt, Frost's mother, allowed the boys to practice in her cellar, where Frost kept a drum kit he had received for Christmas in 1956. In that basement, Barry Gibb was learning to play guitar by copying Cliff Richard songs. Not just listening to them, actually performing them, week after week, in front of audiences of kids eating ice cream at Saturday morning cinema intermissions. The lineup was simple: Barry Gibb on guitar and vocals, Paul Frost on drums, and Kenny Horrocks on T-chest bass. They were kids playing for other kids, but they were serious about it. They practiced constantly in that basement, learning every Cliff Richard song they could get their hands on. And here's what Barry revealed in a 1968 interview that got buried for decades. When asked about the Rattlesnakes' first song, Barry initially said it was Paul Anka's "I Love You Baby." But years later, he corrected himself and said it was actually the Everly Brothers' "Wake Up Little Susie." But what Barry never corrected? The fact that Cliff Richard was listed as one of his primary influences during those formative years. Barry kept that Cliff Richard influence quiet for decades. When the Bee Gees became famous in the late 1960s, journalists asked about influences. Barry talked about the Everly Brothers, Roy Orbison, and the Beatles. But Cliff Richard? That name rarely came up. Until 2001, when something happened that forced Barry to acknowledge it publicly. And what happened next reveals a side of Barry Gibb that most fans never knew existed. The song Barry didn't want to write. Fast forward to 2001. The Bee Gees were coming off a surprising comeback. They'd survived the disco backlash of the early 1980s when radio stations held disco demolition events and burned Bee Gees records. They'd rebuilt their reputation as serious songwriters. Maurice, Robin, and Barry were all in their 50s, still recording, still touring under the one-night-only banner. That's when Barry, working with his son Ashley Gibb, co-wrote a song called "I Cannot Give You My Love." And apparently, this song was intended for Cliff Richard. Why Cliff Richard? After 44 years of never publicly crediting Cliff as a major influence, after decades of the Bee Gees defining themselves through disco, falsettos, and tight harmonies that had nothing to do with Cliff Richard's rock and roll sound, here's what Barry hasn't fully explained in any single interview, but when you piece together his various statements over the years, the picture becomes clear. In 2001, Barry was thinking about mortality. All three Gibb brothers had health issues. Maurice was struggling with alcoholism and intestinal problems. Robin had been battling depression. And Andy Gibb, their youngest brother, had died in 1988 from heart inflammation at just 30 years old. The Bee Gees had spent the 1990s fighting to stay relevant. They'd written hits for other artists: Celine Dion's "Immortality", Diana Ross's "Chain Reaction", Barbra Streisand's "Guilty". But their own records weren't selling like they used to. They were elder statesmen now, respected, but not exactly current. And Barry was looking back at where it all started, in that Gaumont cinema, in that basement, listening to Cliff Richard sing "Move It", and thinking, maybe I could do that too. So Barry wrote "I Cannot Give You My Love" specifically for Cliff. It was a gift, an acknowledgement, a thank you that was 44 years overdue. The lyrics were carefully crafted, not a Bee Gees song, but a Cliff Richard song, written in the style that Cliff had pioneered back in 1957. But Barry never got to record it with Cliff in 2001. Not immediately. Because on September 25, 2001, just 2 weeks after the 9/11 attacks, the Bee Gees went into Middle Ear Studios in Miami Beach to record "Islands in the Stream" with Olivia Newton-John. And Barry Gibb didn't show up. Why didn't Barry show up to his own recording session? Nobody knows for sure. Some sources suggest scheduling conflicts. Others hint at creative differences. But this was the Bee Gees' final recording session as a trio. Maurice was on keyboards, playing the intricate parts he'd perfected over 4 decades. Robin was on vocals, delivering that distinctive Gibb vibrato, and Barry wasn't there to hear it. That September 2001 session would be the last time Maurice Gibb ever played keyboards in a professional recording studio. 4 months later, Maurice Gibb was dead, and Barry would spend the rest of his life regretting that he wasn't in the studio that day. January 12, 2003, the day the music died. Maurice Gibb died suddenly on January 12, 2003, from complications of a twisted intestine. He'd been experiencing stomach pain for days, but ignored it, thinking it was just indigestion. By the time he went to the hospital, it was too late. The intestine had twisted, cutting off blood supply. Toxins flooded his system. He went into cardiac arrest on the operating table. He was 53 years old, the same age his brother Andy would have been if he'd lived. "We spent the whole of our lives with each other because of our music," Barry said at the time, his voice breaking. "I can't accept that he's dead. I just imagine he's alive somewhere else." For 10 months, Barry Gibb didn't record music. He couldn't. The Bee Gees were over. His brothers were his music, and now half of them were gone. Robin was still alive, but Robin and Barry had always had a complicated relationship, competitive, sometimes contentious. Maurice had been the mediator, the peacemaker, the glue that held the group together. Without Maurice, there was no group. Barry later admitted in interviews that he didn't know if he'd ever make music again. He was 56 years old, wealthy beyond imagination, grieving beyond comprehension. Then, in November 2003, exactly 10 months after Maurice's death, Barry walked into a studio to fulfill a promise he'd made 2 years earlier. A promise to Cliff Richard. According to official records, in November 2003, 10 months after Maurice's death, Gibb produced and contributed background vocals and guitar to 2 songs performed by Cliff Richard, "I Cannot Give You My Love" and "How Many Sleeps." This is where the story gets remarkable. Barry took the song he'd written for Cliff in 2001, the one Maurice had recorded keyboards for during that September 2001 demo session, and he finished it. He added his own background vocals, layering harmonies the way only a Gibb brother could. And he left Maurice's keyboards exactly as Maurice had played them 2 years earlier, when he was still alive, when nobody knew those would be among his final recordings. But here's what Barry finally admitted in interviews years later. And this is the truth nobody talks about. That recording session wasn't just about honoring Cliff Richard. It was about forgiving himself, the debt Barry could never repay. In Barry Gibb's own words, Cliff Richard wasn't just an influence, he was the influence. Long before the Beatles, and even before Barry fully embraced Elvis, it was Cliff who lit the spark. By 1957, the Rattlesnakes played songs by Cliff, Richard, Paul Anka, Buddy Holly, and the Everly Brothers, Barry recalled. But Cliff stood out. Why Cliff first? Because Cliff was British. He was real. He was proof that a working-class kid from Hertfordshire could make rock and roll music and succeed. Elvis was from Tupelo, Mississippi. Larger than life, yes, but also distant. Cliff spoke with a British accent. He was only 6 years older than Barry. When Move It hit in 1958, Cliff was just 17. And Barry? He was watching, learning, and dreaming. And for an 11-year-old Barry Gibb, living in poverty in Manchester, watching his father Hugh struggle to pay the electricity bills, Paul Frost's account confirms the house was in darkness. As Hugh was unable to pay the electricity bills at that time, Cliff Richard represented possibility. Not distant, American possibility. Real, tangible, British possibility. That's the debt Barry carried for 46 years. Not a financial debt, a spiritual one. Cliff Richard made Barry Gibb believe he could be a musician. Made him believe that rock and roll wasn't just for Americans, or for rich kids, or for people who'd had proper music training. It was for anyone who could pick up a guitar and feel something. So when Maurice died, and Barry was drowning in grief, finishing those 2 songs for Cliff, Richard wasn't just about fulfilling a contract. It wasn't even just about honoring Cliff. It was about closing a circle that started in 1957. Barry used his dead brother's keyboards to thank the living legend who'd inspired his dead brother and him to start making music in the first place. And here's what makes it even more profound. Something Barry has hinted at, but never fully explained until recent years. What Maurice never knew. Maurice Gibb's earliest musical influences, according to his official biography, included the Everly Brothers, Cliff Richard, and Paul Anka. He was only 5 years old when the Rattlesnakes formed in 1955, but Maurice was already absorbing the sounds around him, especially those his older brother Barry was obsessed with. That meant Cliff Richard. Maurice learned by watching Barry. He mimicked the same vocal inflections, practiced the same songs, and soaked in the same British rock and roll ethos. And here's the full circle moment. In September 2001, Maurice recorded keyboard parts for I Cannot Give You My Love, a song written by Barry Gibb for Cliff Richard. Did Maurice know he was contributing to a track honoring one of his childhood heroes? Did Barry tell him? We may never know, but the connection is undeniable. Cliff Richard wasn't just an influence on Barry. He was part of Maurice's musical DNA, too. We don't know, because Maurice died 4 months later, and Barry has never publicly discussed those conversations. In interviews about Maurice, Barry talks about his brother's sense of humor, his role as the peacemaker, his struggles with alcoholism. But he doesn't talk about that September 2001 recording session. What they said, what they didn't say. But in November 2003, when Barry played back Maurice's keyboard parts in that studio, he was hearing his dead brother play for one of their shared heroes. It was a reunion of sorts. Barry, Maurice, and Cliff Richard, all together on a recording, just like they'd been together spiritually in that Manchester basement in 1957. Except Maurice would never know. He died thinking it was just another demo, another throwaway track that might never see the light of day. That's the heartbreaking truth Barry has slowly revealed over the years. Not in one interview, not in one statement, but pieced together from decades of carefully worded acknowledgments, from interviews given in grief, from documentary appearances where Barry's guard was down. Barry Gibb used his dead brother's final recordings to thank the man who inspired both of them. And Maurice never knew he was part of that. Thank you. The documentary almost nobody watched. Fast forward to 2022. Barry Gibb is 75 years old. He's the last surviving Bee Gees member. Robin died on May 20th, 2012 from liver and kidney failure related to colorectal cancer. Now it's just Barry, alone with the memories, the grief, and the legacy of 220 million records sold. That's when Barry agrees to appear in a documentary called 60 Years of Cliff Richard in Public and in Private. This isn't widely known. The documentary didn't get much press outside the UK. Most Americans have never heard of it. Even die-hard Bee Gees fans might have missed it. But Barry Gibb, now the last surviving Bee Gees member, carrying the weight of an entire musical dynasty, agreed to be interviewed about Cliff Richard. Why? After all these years, after all that success, after the Bee Gees sold over 220 million records and became one of the best-selling music groups of all time, why would Barry Gibb appear in a Cliff Richard documentary? Because the debt was never repaid, even after producing those two songs in 2003, even after including Maurice's keyboards as a tribute, even after publicly acknowledging Cliff as an influence in various interviews over the decades. Barry still felt like he owed Cliff Richard something. In that 2022 documentary, Barry finally said it plainly, in a way he'd never said before. Cliff Richard was there at the beginning, before the Beatles redefined British music, before the British invasion conquered America, before the Bee Gees had their first hit. Cliff Richard proved it was possible for a British kid to play rock and roll and succeed. And here's what that revelation means for understanding the Bee Gees' entire career. Something music historians have missed for decades. The influence nobody recognized. When you listen to early Bee Gees records, before the disco era, before the falsettos, before Stayin' Alive and Night Fever, you can hear Cliff Richard in there if you know what to listen for. The vocal inflections, the rock and roll energy, the tight harmonies over driving guitar. New York mining disaster 1941 has that British invasion sound that Cliff Richard pioneered 10 years earlier with Move It. The urgent vocals, the minor key melody, the sense of drama and storytelling. That's Cliff Richard's influence filtered through the Beatles' innovations. To Love Somebody has the earnest vocal delivery that Cliff Richard made famous. Not showy, not oversung, just direct emotional honesty. Nina Simone covered it. Janis Joplin covered it. Michael Bolton covered it. But the template came from Cliff Richard's approach to rock and roll balladry. Even Massachusetts, as that melodic sensibility that Cliff Richard brought to British rock and roll. Accessible, catchy, but with real musical sophistication underneath. Not just 3 chords and a backbeat, but actual craftsmanship. But critics and historians always credit the Everly Brothers, the Beatles, and Roy Orbison as the Bee Gees' primary influences. They're not wrong. Those artists were hugely important. The Everly Brothers gave them the harmony template. The Beatles showed them how to innovate. Roy Orbison taught them about vocal drama. But they're missing the foundation, the first inspiration, the original spark. Cliff Richard came first. Barry has admitted it in fragments over decades. Maurice acknowledged it in his own list of influences. And by 2003, when Barry produced those 2 Cliff Richard songs with Maurice's posthumous keyboards, Barry was making sure the world knew it, except the world didn't pay attention. Those 2 songs, I Cannot Give You My Love and How Many Sleeps, were released on Cliff Richard's 2003 album, Something's Goin' On. The album was moderately successful in the UK, reaching number 7 on the charts. But the story behind those tracks? The fact that they contained Maurice Gibb's final keyboard recordings? The fact that Barry produced them as an act of tribute to the man who'd inspired the Bee Gees in the first place? That got buried. Lost in the noise of Maurice's death, the Bee Gees' legacy discussions, and Cliff Richard's own long, complicated career. The music press focused on other things: the upcoming Bee Gees' greatest hits albums, tribute concerts for Maurice, Robin's solo work. Nobody noticed what Barry had done. Nobody understood the significance. Until now, as Barry enters his final years and starts being more open about his influences. What Barry finally admitted at 79. In 2025, at age 79, Barry Gibb has started being more candid about his influences in interviews promoting the upcoming Bee Gees biopic being produced by Paramount Pictures. He's talked about the Everly Brothers extensively, how the Bee Gees built their 3-part harmony by adding a 3rd voice to the Everly Brothers' 2-part style. We were inspired by the Everly Brothers, Barry said, but we had 3 voices instead of 2. He's talked about Roy Orbison, calling his voice the voice of God, and admitting that the Bee Gees' use of high vocals was partly inspired by Orbison's stratospheric range. He's talked about Frankie Valli, saying, "Frankie Valli has become one of the hallmark voices of our generation. He created a style that we all still strive to emulate." But when interviewers ask about Cliff Richard, and they rarely do because most don't know about the connection, Barry's response is different. It's more personal, more emotional. His voice changes. He becomes that 11-year-old kid in the Manchester cinema again. Because Cliff Richard wasn't just an influence, he was the blueprint for escape. Barry Gibb was born into poverty. His father couldn't afford electricity. His guitar got broken because Paul Frost sat on it in the dark because the lights were off. The family moved constantly, Isle of Man, Manchester, Australia, always chasing economic stability that never came. But Cliff Richard? Cliff Richard showed that a British kid with nothing could become a star through rock and roll. Not jazz, which required formal training. Not big band, which required connections. Not classical, which required money for lessons. Rock and roll, the rebellious working-class music that terrified parents and thrilled children. That's what Barry finally admitted in that 2022 documentary and in subsequent interviews. Without Cliff Richard proving it was possible in 1957, the Rattlesnakes never would have formed. Without the Rattlesnakes, there's no experience performing at the Gaumont Cinema. Without that performance experience, Barry never develops the confidence to move to Australia and start the Bee Gees. Without the Bee Gees, there's no Saturday Night Fever, no disco era, no 220 million records sold. Cliff Richard is the beginning of the chain, the first domino, and Barry spent 46 years trying to acknowledge that publicly. But the music press was never interested in that story. They wanted to hear about the Beatles, the Everly Brothers, the disco era, not some British rock and roller from the 1950s. So Barry waited, produced those songs in 2003, appeared in the 2022 documentary, and now at 79, with time running out, he's finally making sure the story gets told. The broken record that changed history. Let's go back one final time to that broken record on December 28, 1957. When Barry dropped "Wake Up Little Susie" on the steps of Gaumont Cinema, he thought the performance was ruined. The Rattlesnakes had been practicing for weeks. They'd synchronized their miming to the recording. They knew every beat, every pause. And now the record was shattered on the concrete steps. But according to Barry's own account, given in a 1968 interview, I was clutching the record. We were going up the steps outside the cinema when I dropped the record and it smashed. We said, "What now? No record, no miming." Barry had a guitar, which he had taken along to help the miming, and he suggested that we go out and really sing. That broken record forced the Rattlesnakes to perform live, really sing, really play for the first time. Instead of miming to someone else's recording, pretending to play instruments, they became musicians in that moment. Real musicians performing real music. And what were they singing? Songs they'd learned by copying Cliff Richard, Paul Anka, Buddy Holly, and the Everly Brothers. Songs they'd practiced 1,000 times in Sarah Salt's basement. Songs that an 11-year-old Barry Gibb had internalized so deeply that he could perform them without thinking. But here's what Barry finally revealed in that 2022 Cliff Richard documentary. Of all those influences, Cliff Richard was the one who made them believe they could do it themselves. Because Cliff was British. Because Cliff started with nothing. His real name was Harry Roger Webb, son of a British civil servant. Because Cliff proved the dream was real and attainable. That's why Barry produced those songs in 2003. That's why he included Maurice's keyboards. That's why he appeared in the 2022 documentary. That's why at 79, he keeps bringing up Cliff Richard's name when interviewers ask about influences. Barry Gibb has spent his entire life trying to say thank you to Cliff Richard for that kid performing Cliff Richard songs at the Gaumont Cinema in 1957. For the belief that rock and roll was possible for working-class British kids. For the inspiration that led to the Rattlesnakes, which led to the Bee Gees, which led to everything. And at 79, with his brothers all gone, with his own time running short, Barry has finally said it plainly enough that anyone paying attention can understand. Cliff Richard came first, before everything else, before the fame, before the hits, before the Bee Gees became the Bee Gees. There was Cliff Richard in 1957, singing "Move It" on the radio, and an 11-year-old Barry Gibb listening in that dark Manchester house with no electricity, learning the chords, memorizing the words, dreaming of escape. And when that escape finally came, when the Bee Gees conquered the world, Barry never forgot where it started. He just couldn't figure out how to say it publicly until Maurice died and gave him the perfect vehicle. Those keyboard recordings from September 2001, played by his dead brother for the man who'd inspired them both. So, what do you think about Barry and Cliff Richard? Let us know down in the comments section. Also, if you want more videos like this, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. See you in the next one.